Released in 1975, Jaws, the horror masterpiece by young director Steven Spielberg, marked a turning point that gave birth to Hollywood's very concept of the summer blockbuster. Based on Peter Benchley's novel Jaws, tells the story of the peaceful town of Amity, haunted by a massive great white shark, where three men, a police chief, a marine biologist, and a sea captain must confront humanity's most primal fear, being hunted in the endless ocean. Behind this blockbuster lies a reality the audience could never imagine. They used real alcohol, real fear, real blood to create a film that viewers called a blockbuster. But the people who made it called a torture experience, a mechanical shark that actually bit people. An actor so psychologically traumatized he couldn't sleep for years. A young director who had to flee the set, terrified that the crew might seek revenge. All of it just to create a monster that audiences wouldn't even see during the first full hour of the film. Jaws isn't just a story about a shark. It's a story about Hollywood's own cruelty, where the limits of ethics, safety, and trust were all swallowed whole. And today, we'll reopen the forbidden diary of that film, set 20 strange, haunting, and terrifying truths behind Jaws 1975. 1. Susan Backliney was actually yanked underwater in the opening scene. The opening of Jaws is one of the most iconic moments in cinema history. A woman swimming peacefully under the moonlight suddenly pulled down and screaming in terror. But few realise that Scream wasn't acting. Susan Backliney, a swimsuit model cast as Chrissy Watkins, was tied to an actual set of underwater anchors. On each side of the shore, 5 crew members gripped ropes connected to her body and pulled her violently, following Spielberg's signals. No one told her when they would yank. There were no safety cues, no warning. When the first pull came, Susan thought her muscles had torn. She screamed for real, gasping for air, but they pulled again harder from side to side, just like a shark attacking live prey. When she finally lost consciousness and seawater filled her lungs, they stopped shooting. Spielberg later admitted, "I really did scare her, to make the audience scared." No one on set called it violence, they called it art. But decades later, Susan still said, "I can still hear my own scream every time I look at the ocean." When you watch that scene, do you think it's real or CGI? That final tug didn't just take her scream, it took a part of her body too. 2. Backliney was injured and temporarily lost her hearing. During the third pull, as the crew shouted, harder this time, Susan was jerked violently out of the water. Her head slammed into the ocean surface hard as steel. A dry thud echoed across the waves. She didn't know what had happened. All she heard was a muffled buzzing in her right ear like sand being poured into a tube, then total silence. Her hearing was gone on one side for days. No doctor was called, no safety officer, no insurance. A crew member simply tossed her a bottle of liniment oil and said, "You'll be fine. Take 10 minutes and get back in." They kept shooting while Susan trembled in the water, her eyes red, her lips turning blue. When the scene finally wrapped, she stared blankly into the camera. The fear, exhaustion, and panic you see on her face in the final cut were all real. The world called Jaws terrifyingly realistic. But for Susan Backliney, real was the one word she never wanted to hear again. And yet, her suffering was only the beginning. Once the cameras rolled, the film itself began to devour its own crew. 3. The crew called Jaws flaws because everything broke. Originally, Jaws was scheduled for a 55-day shoot, modest, manageable, just a small survival thriller. But the ocean had other plans. Machines broke down, and the 26-year-old director had no idea he was stepping into a 159-day nightmare. Strong winds, freezing water, actors shivering uncontrollably, cameras corroded by salt, boats tilting under heavy waves. Every morning Spielberg sat on deck, staring at the horizon, asking himself, will anyone survive to shoot today? The budget ballooned from $4 million to $9 million, and Universal began to lose patience. Rumours spread across the set. Spielberg's getting fired. The movie's being shut down. The exhausted crew mocked their own project, calling it flaws. Roy Scheider later said, "Nobody loved the movie while we were making it, and Spielberg wrote a single line in his diary, 'I think my career just sank at sea.' Because Jaws wasn't filmed in a water tank, it was filmed in the real ocean." 4. Shot on the real ocean. No CGI, no safety net. No one had ever done it before. No computer graphics, no studio tanks, no controlled environment. Spielberg wanted authenticity, so he dragged the entire crew out to the open waters off Martha's Vineyard, deep, cold, unpredictable, where every mistake could mean death. The cameras rocked violently with each wave. If a single sailboat appeared on the horizon, filming had to stop for 90 minutes until it drifted out of sight. The sound was ruined by the wind, props soaked, actors vomiting from seasickness. Every shot required dozens of takes, and the worst part, none of them were insured. One crew member later said, "If anyone had died, the studio would have pretended this movie never existed." They worked 12 hours a day in 50-degree water, surrounded by nothing but sea and sky. No exit, no doctor, no safety boat nearby, just a fake shark falling apart and a real crew losing their sanity. Then one day, the sea stopped being a backdrop. It started fighting back. 5. The real Orca sank and the actors nearly drowned. The Orca, the legendary boat symbolising man's war against the beast, became a real-life threat itself. One afternoon in June, rough waves battered its hull. The pump failed and water began flooding the deck. Roy Scheider and Richard Dreyfuss were mid-scene when the boat tilted 45 degrees. They thought Spielberg was creating a realistic rocking effect. But as freezing water reached their knees, they realised the Orca was actually sinking. Panic erupted. The boom operator threw his mic rig into the sea to swim free. Some cast members couldn't even swim. Spielberg shouted through a loudspeaker, "Save the actors first, the cameras can drown." They managed to haul everyone onto rescue boats amid the chaos. But the camera containing all that day's footage went under. Miraculously, cinematographer Bill Butler discovered that the film stock was saltwater resistant and rushed it to be developed. Not a single frame was lost. After that day, Spielberg wrote in his journal, "I'm not afraid of sharks anymore. I'm afraid of the ocean. Because sometimes the real danger didn't come from the shark, it came from the movie itself." 6. Roy Scheider was genuinely injured on the Orca. In one scene aboard the Orca, Roy Scheider, who played Chief Brody, had to stand at the bow pulling a cable attached to a floating barrel. A sudden wave slammed against the boat, throwing him off balance. He fell forward, hitting his head on the metal deck. Blood streamed down his face. The crew panicked, but Spielberg didn't yell, "Cut!" The camera kept rolling. He quietly told cinematographer Bill Butler, "Keep that shot. It's too real." Dizzy and dazed, Scheider kept acting. The blood on his forehead in that shot is real. The take made it into the final cut of the film. No one stopped filming. No one called a medic. Someone just handed him a rag to wipe his face and they kept shooting. Weeks later, Scheider discovered the gash was deep enough to require 8 stitches. Yet instead of complaining, he simply said, "If that shot makes the audience believe it, then the wound was worth it." What do you think when you watch that scene? Real blood was spilled, but the tragedy didn't stop there. Just days later, another shot nearly cost an actor his sight. 7. Richard Dreyfuss almost lost his eyesight during the yellow barrel scene.
Make it fast! We got another lion in him! I can't! He's trying to run! Gotta give it a ride! Pull you, son of a bitch!
It was the sequence where Hooper, the young marine biologist, throws a hook line toward the floating barrels while the mechanical shark Bruce is being pulled by hidden underwater cables. The wind picked up. The waves rose higher than expected. One cable snapped, and a barrel nearly 20 kilograms of metal and foam flew straight toward Richard Dreyfuss. No one had time to shout, "Cut!" The heavy prop whipped past his face, missing his eyes by mere inches. A piece of metal struck his cheek, slicing it open. Blood splashed into the seawater. The set fell silent. Spielberg leaned down and whispered, "You okay, Richard? We need one more take. No goggles, no stunt double." They made Dreyfuss redo the scene the next morning. This time he wore his own sunglasses, the only protection he had. Years later, he recalled in an interview, "If that barrel had flown a few centimeters closer, I'd never have seen the shark again. Just darkness. And the next kind of pain wouldn't come from the ocean, but from another human being." 8. Robert Shaw was drunk and tormented his co-star. Robert Shaw, who played the grizzled Captain Quint, was a veteran actor, tough, brilliant, and utterly fearless. But he was also the real monster of the set. He drank whiskey every day, often before sunrise. And once drunk, he began taunting Richard Dreyfuss, his younger co-star, with cruel sarcasm. "Hey kid, I never seen a real man work before." At first, it was teasing. Then it became harassment. Shaw mocked Dreyfuss at lunch, threw props into the ocean, even dared him to jump off the boat from 90 feet up. Dreyfuss endured it quietly, until one day he snapped and tossed Shaw's drink into the sea. The air froze. Just as the two men were about to come to blows, Spielberg stepped between them. "Not on my set, nobody dies for real here." The hostility between them grew so intense, they refused to speak off camera. But that real hatred burned into the film, making their on-screen confrontations on the Orca eerily authentic. Alcohol turned Robert Shaw into a monster on set. But one night, that same whiskey shattered him completely right in the middle of a scene. 9. The USS Indianapolis monolog was filmed in a drunken haze.
Japanese submarine slammed 2 torpedoes into our side, Chief. He was coming back from the island of Tinian to Leyte, just delivered the bomb, the Hiroshima bomb.
It's the legendary USS Indianapolis speech, one of the most haunting monologues in film history. The boat is quiet, the lights dim, the waves gently tapping the hull. Quint recalls the horror of 900 sailors eaten alive by sharks with eyes that seemed to have seen it all. But behind the camera, Robert Shaw was too drunk to stand. He slurred his lines, forgot words, even fell out of his chair. The crew sat in uneasy silence. Spielberg shot what little he could salvage. The next morning, a sober Shaw came to him, eyes red and ashamed. "Steve, I'm sorry. Let me do it again." And in that second take, he delivered a performance so raw, so human, that the entire crew went silent. No acting, no fake tears, just a man telling the story of a hell he thought he'd escaped but was still trapped inside. Sometimes the demons didn't come from the bottle, but from another man made of flesh and salt. 10. Craig Kingsbury, the real fisherman who taught Shaw to become a demon. Before filming, Spielberg introduced Robert Shaw to Craig Kingsbury, a local fisherman from Martha's Vineyard who had spent his whole life at sea. He wasn't an actor. He'd never been on a stage. But when he spoke, his voice was thick with salt and rum, and every story smelled faintly of death and tide. Kingsbury told Shaw tales of shipwrecks of sailors dragged into the deep, of the eerie clang of metal echoing across the waves. He said, "The sea doesn't eat men. It just takes back what it gave." Shaw listened in silence. From that day on, he began to speak like Kingsbury, laugh like Kingsbury, and drink as if seawater ran through his veins. The tone gestures and gaze of Quint all bore the imprint of that fisherman's spirit. People later said Craig Kingsbury didn't just lend Robert Shaw his voice, he gave him the soul of the ocean. From that moment on, no one could tell where Quint ended and Shaw began. Do you think Shaw truly became Quint? Because what came next proved that even a steel monster could bite for real. 11. Bruce, the mechanical shark that actually bit people. Bruce, the name the crew gave the mechanical shark, was hailed as a technological marvel of the 1970s, over 1.2 tons in weight, nearly 8 meters long, powered by a complex hydraulic system. But to the technical team, Bruce wasn't a machine, it was a deranged creature. Just days after installation during a test run, Bruce's steel jaws suddenly snapped shut while an engineer was inspecting its teeth. His arm was crushed, bones fractured, blood spilling onto the deck. The crew froze. Spielberg muttered in disbelief. It bit someone, for real. And that wasn't the only time. Throughout filming, Bruce constantly malfunctioned, exploding hydraulics, jammed mechanisms, rising at the wrong moments, forcing dangerous scenes to be halted again and again. Once, the entire metal shark sank to the bottom of Nantucket Bay, and divers had to use cranes to haul it back up. The crew grew so terrified, they gave it a new nickname, the Great White Turd. One technician later joked, half in fear, half in truth. The shark in the movie never breaks, but our real shark wanted to kill us all. Even the man who created it, Steven Spielberg, slowly felt himself being devoured by his own monster. 12. Spielberg driven to madness by Bruce. Each morning, Spielberg would arrive early and stare at Bruce hanging motionless from a crane, black-soaked and heavy as a nightmare. He knew that if even one tiny valve failed, 70 people would have to wait for hours. And of course, Bruce always failed. Hydraulic fluid leaked everywhere. The motors screamed mid-scene. When the waves hit hard, the shark's body twisted like a corpse. Spielberg stopped sleeping. He snapped at crew members, slamming his hand on the boat deck and shouting, "Cut, cut, everything!" One assistant recalled. We saw it in his eyes. It wasn't anger anymore, it was real fear, because Bruce wouldn't work. Spielberg was forced to improvise. Instead of showing the shark, he hid it. He let audiences hear the music, see the water, and fear what they can't see. He later said, "I stopped making a movie about a shark. I started making a movie about my own fear." And the next scene might be the most unbelievable of all, because the film's most terrifying moment was shot in a backyard swimming pool. 13. Ben Gardner's head filmed in a backyard pool. After the first test screening, Spielberg felt something was missing. The movie, he said, wasn't scary enough. He wanted one more shock, something that would make audiences jump. Universal refused to give more money, so Spielberg paid $3,000 out of pocket and rebuilt the entire Ben Gardner's head sequence himself. No studio, no ocean. The scene was filmed in the backyard swimming pool of editor Verna Fields. Spielberg poured milk into the water to make it murky like the deep sea, installed lights under the surface, and used a lifelike replica of the actor's head. When that head suddenly popped out of the boat's hull, Spielberg shouted, "That's it! That's the one!" The moment became one of the most famous jump scares in film history. A fright born not from technology, but from pure human obsession. Spielberg later laughed in an interview, "I just wanted to scare the audience one more time. Turns out, I scared myself too." Did that scene make you jump? The next one is even more shocking, because the reason Hooper survives was thanks to a real shark attack. 14. The shark cage scene so dangerous it changed the script. Most of the underwater footage for Jaws was shot off the coast of South Australia by husband and wife shark experts Ron and Valerie Taylor. To make the shark look bigger, they used a smaller cage and a short stunt diver inside it. That decision nearly led to tragedy. During filming, a real great white shark charged the cage, tearing through the steel bars and thrashing violently. The crew screamed, thinking the diver inside had been killed, but by sheer luck, he hadn't yet entered the water. The footage was sent to Hollywood, and when Spielberg saw it, he was stunned. The image of a real shark trapped and thrashing was too powerful to discard. He immediately rewrote the script. In the original novel, Hooper dies in the cage, but in the film, he lives, thanks to that real-life attack. A moment that almost became tragedy turned into cinematic magic. The shark cage attack was real, but at least no one was hurt. The same couldn't be said for the film's opening scene, which haunted one woman for the rest of her life. 15. Susan Backliney called it torture. Years after Jaws became a legend, Susan Backliney finally spoke out. She recalled that opening scene, the one everyone praised as so real, it's terrifying. "They never told me they'd pull that hard," she said. "When the ropes jerked, I felt my ribs crack. I thought I was going to die. No one cut the camera. No one jumped in to help. Spielberg just stood there waiting until she was completely exhausted before signalling to stop." By then, Susan was half unconscious in the freezing water. Years later, when invited to re-watch the film, she shuddered. "I heard my own scream again, and I didn't know if I was watching a movie or watching the moment I almost died." That opening scene made Jaws immortal. But for Susan Backliney, it wasn't a scene at all. It was a trauma frozen in cold salt water, one that's lasted 50 years. And perhaps the cruelest twist of all, the man who wrote Jaws ended up hating the movie. 16. Peter Benchley condemned the film's morality. Peter Benchley, author of the original Jaws novel, was at first proud to see his story brought to life by Spielberg, but when he watched the finished film, he was horrified. He hated the ending. "No shark deserves to die like that," he said. In his book, the shark dies from blood loss, a grim but natural conclusion. In the movie, it explodes in a fireball, destroyed like some demonic monster that must be punished. Benchley feared audiences would come to see sharks as humanity's enemies. He was right. After Jaws premiered, shark killings around the world skyrocketed. Fishermen organised shark hunting contests out of fear and fascination. For the rest of his life, Benchley tried to atone for that mistake. He wrote books and documentaries advocating shark conservation, becoming one of their most passionate defenders. When asked why he'd changed, he simply said, "I created the world's greatest fear. Now I have to spend my life erasing it." Do you agree with Peter Benchley's view? Because fear itself soon became a real disorder in another man's mind. 17. Richard Dreyfuss developed anxiety after Jaws. When Jaws was filmed, Richard Dreyfuss was barely in his 20s, energetic, eager, thrilled to work with Spielberg. He didn't know the experience would leave him with chronic anxiety. For years afterward, Dreyfuss said he couldn't go near the ocean. Every time he heard waves, he'd see Robert Shaw drunk glaring at him from across the boat's deck, laughing in the dark. "I dreamed he was standing at the end of the boat waiting for me, and I didn't know if it was Quint or Shaw." The real tension and fights on set left Dreyfuss terrified of water scenes, engine noises, even the smell of machine oil. After Jaws premiered and made him a star, he admitted, "I was supposed to feel happy, but I didn't. I just remembered the cold and the loneliness on that boat." Fame came quickly, but the cost was a fear that never faded, not of the shark, but of the man in the shadows. And after Dreyfuss, it was Spielberg himself who began to lose sleep, not because of the shark, but because of his own crew. 18. Spielberg fled the set on the final night. It was the last night of filming. 159 days, 70 people, one shark that never worked. Everyone was exhausted, half-mad, desperate to celebrate with a cruel little joke. Rumours spread. When we wrap, we're throwing Spielberg into the water. The 27-year-old director laughed nervously, but deep down he knew they might be serious. I loved them, Spielberg later said. But I knew they'd do it. So the moment he shouted, cut for the final scene, he vanished. No wrap party, no photos. Only the sound of helicopter blades slicing through the night, carrying Spielberg away from Martha's Vineyard. Years later, he laughed and said, "I just didn't want to be their next shark." The film ended in laughter, but the fear lingered even for the man who created it. 19. Spielberg's lifelong fear of the ocean. After Jaws became a worldwide phenomenon, Spielberg didn't celebrate the way everyone expected. He didn't return to the sea. He didn't swim, didn't sail. Just hearing waves made him freeze, hearing that dudum, dudum in his head. "I hear John Williams' music every time I'm near water," he said, and I step back. For nearly 10 years, he refused to enter the ocean, even on family vacations. That fear seeped into his later work, the stormy lights of Close Encounters, the roars of Jurassic Park, all pulsed with the same heartbeat, the same breath as Jaws. Spielberg once admitted, "I never really left the Orca. I just turned it into a spaceship, a theme park. Another nightmare." The shark stopped swimming on screen, but in his mind it never died. And the final revelation may outrage movie lovers everywhere. The ship that carried film history met a fate it didn't deserve. 20. The Orca was cut to pieces. Years after Jaws' release, Spielberg returned to Universal Studios to visit the Orca, the legendary boat that symbolized man's battle with the beast. But when he arrived, he found only splintered wood in a damp storage shed. No one at the studio even remembered where it had been stored. One employee shrugged. "We chopped it up. I needed space for a new camera truck." Spielberg stood silently for a long time. No anger, no words, just a sigh. And then he said a single line that people still quote today. "They don't understand. This was the corpse of a dream." The Orca was gone, but in the minds of audiences it still sails endlessly on the waters of 1975, carrying screams, waves, and the shadow of a mechanical shark that made the world believe fear could be real. And maybe that not the shark is the true legend of Jaws. When audiences left theatres in 1975, they thought they'd seen a horror movie, but for those who lived through it on the waters of Martha's Vineyard, it was a memory they'd rather forget. Everyone paid a price so the world could see a shark that wasn't real, but a fear that absolutely was. Jaws isn't just a film about a sea monster. It's a story about human obsession, the need to control what cannot be controlled, and the price of touching that boundary. Half a century later, the ocean has washed away the crew's footprints. But every time those two notes play da-dum, da-dum, we still shiver. Not because we fear the shark, but because we know the real terror has always lived inside us, and the camera simply captured it. Which fact surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more deep dives into Hollywood's hidden stories.